my thanks to the choir for that very, very beautiful piece. Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to be here this morning. And thank you for reminding me of something I learned a number of years ago when I first began working for Week of Compassion in the early 1990s. I learned early on that we disciples were large enough of a church to have a witness throughout the world. And every place I ever traveled, even to some very sometimes unusual and difficult places like in Afghanistan or Congo or North Korea even, every place I went, I always found some expression that we disciples were there. And it made me proud and pleased to be part of a church that could have that kind of witness throughout the world. But also I learned, especially as I traveled among our congregations, that I never went to a congregation that I didn't find somebody that I was in school with, that I knew from some previous ministry, or who had an aunt that I knew, or a friend or a cousin or something or another. And it made me realize that though we were large enough to have a witness throughout the world, we were still small enough to be like a family. And you have welcomed me as one of your own, like a family, and I've made a number of connections with people here that I didn't know before were here at this church. And so it's been a delight to be here so far, and I really appreciate the invitation to be here. Actually, I'm very much aware that Amy Gopp, who was the most recent director of Week of Compassion, had been invited to be here, and in the latter part of 2013, Amy moved on to other pastures, and I was invited to return as the interim director, and I'm grateful that you all still kept the invitation. It has been a gift to be here. It's been a gift to be here and to worship in this beautiful sanctuary. It's been a gift to learn of your many ministries of outreach in this community. As a matter of fact, as Doris was reading the story this morning, it made me think that you all are very much enfleshing that parable here in this community. And it's good to be able to celebrate the partnership that we share together in this vital ministry we call Week of Compassion. Recently, I read an article where the Reverend Elizabeth Mitchell Clement described Jesus' methodology of congregational ministry as a long conversation on the way together as life happens between meals. That was, to me, an arresting, intriguing, honest description I've ever heard, not just of Jesus' understanding of congregational ministry, but maybe even Jesus' understanding of life and faith. A long conversation on the way together as life happens between, we might add, even over or around meals and the table. When I think back on my own most memorable and pleasurable experiences in the church, so many of those are about meals. Maybe it was memories of great fellowship dinners or homecoming dinner on the church grounds, meals in people's homes. This past week, my wife Deb and I had the great pleasure of hosting some longtime friends and partners, BJ and Chippo Mpofu from Zimbabwe, in our home. They were there for a week. And we would be sitting at table, breakfast, lunch, dinner at night, and all of a sudden 2 hours had passed over a great meal and these long conversations of our sharing life together, unforgettable experiences. And is there a better way to describe those of us who make our ecclesial home in the disciples of Christ, at least when we are at our best, than a long conversation on the way together as life happens about the table? And most certainly this is a fitting description for the Gospel of Luke, from which the reading this morning comes. Indeed, one could describe Luke's Gospel itself as a long conversation of Jesus and his followers as they're making their way together toward Jerusalem around the table. As a matter of fact, Luke understands more than any other New Testament writer that where you have some people who eat and some people who don't eat, you do not yet have the kingdom of God. And so Luke loves to tell stories about meals, about the table. No place else will you find Jesus and the disciples at table breaking bread more often than with Luke. And one of those stories, the text for this morning, is actually known as the parable of the great dinner. The great dinner. When I think back on my own years with Week of Compassion, I have come to understand that what this special ministry of our church is all about is just this. It's really a long conversation on the way together as life happens, with all the good and the bad, with the tornadoes and the earthquakes and the hurricanes and the famines, the mudslides, the wars, the civil and economic upheaval. And so often it is somehow about the table. And it's especially about the table with the hungry and the poor and the vulnerable and the forgotten, the left out, and the lost. So if you will indulge me for a bit this morning, what I would like to do is invite you to meet some of these guests with whom we share bread, and who also teach us what it means to share in this great dinner. And as I think about it, they're not so much companions that we have invited to my table or your table, as really they are companions who invite us to their table. For example, I am sure that the invitation list for Luke's great dinner includes a lot of people from the nation of Haiti. Haiti, as you perhaps know, is the poorest country in our hemisphere. It's one of the poorest in the world, where the average person earns less than the world's minimum survival wage of the equivalent of $1 US a day. I visited Haiti for the first time with a group of disciples from Tennessee. We were on a mission trip to do some rebuilding after a recent hurricane. On the first day of our work project, we asked the little guest house where we were staying if they would prepare a very simple meal for us. We were not comfortable eating food prepared by the village, as we were told this was an extremely poor community, even by Haitian standards, and quite honestly, some of us were a bit wary of Haitian hygiene, or even better, the lack thereof. Well, late in the morning, as the noon hour was approaching, we noticed some of the women in the village were bringing out pots of rice and platters of fruit and other dishes to a large mango tree near our work site. I happened to be working alongside our Haitian host, a local pastor by the name of Donjou. And Donjou looked at me and he said, "Johnny, it's time for lunch. Would you gather your group together, come over to the mango tree, and would you be so good as to say the blessing?" And I said what I regret now. I said to Donjou, please don't worry about us. We brought our lunch. We'll just eat over by the van. Let the people here enjoy this meal. And he looked at me and he said, "Johnny, you cannot do that. Look, the women here have prepared lunch for you." And I said, "But Donjou, really, it's okay. We've got our lunch. We'll be fine, please." And he said, No. You must eat with us." And I said, "Well, we can't." And he said, "But you must." And then he said, "Johnny, I must share with you a proverb from Haiti." I would learn that there are a lot of Haitian proverbs, but this was the one Donjou shared. Cooked food has no owner. Cooked food has no owner. Did you get it? I did not get it at first, but then I got it. In other words, what we have is not ours. What we have is a gift from God, and it is meant to be shared with everybody. And so we brought out our little sandwiches, and they brought out heaping bowls of rice and platters of mango and papaya and pineapple. And I got to say the blessing. And you talk about a long conversation on the way together as life happens around a table. We had, under that mango tree, a great, great dinner. A little later, I got to go back to Haiti, this time to visit development projects that we disciples were supporting through Week of Compassion. One of the projects was a small microcredit income generating project. There was a woman who had received a little loan from this project. She had purchased a sewing machine and some material and had a little tailoring business going. There were other examples of that, one of which was a group of women who got together, borrowed some money, built some chicken coops, and then about every couple of months were selling about 600 fryers in the marketplace there. One of those women in that group was a 70-something-year-old grandmother named Evangeline. Appropriately, I think. That's a good name. It's a biblical name from the New Testament word evangel, meaning good news. She is known affectionately and reverently in her community and in her little church as the Grande Dame, a moniker that she quickly reminded me, lest I be overly impressed, is best translated into English as Big Mama, which interestingly enough was an interesting moniker for a woman who was about 4'2" and maybe weighed 75 pounds dripping wet. Well, we visited the project. It was an amazing project. We heard their stories of how this project was making such a difference now in their lives. We took some photos. It was almost time for us to leave, but Evangeline insisted that my traveling companion and me come to her home, which was just a little house, one room, cinder block. Inside there was a little bed, there were a couple of chairs, a table. She asked us to sit down. She reached under the bed, she pulled out a wooden box, opened it up, and took out 2 dusty bottles of Pepsi Cola. And she opened up a little cabinet on the wall and took out a package of cookies. I have no idea how long she had been saving those Pepsis and those cookies, but if any of you have ever eaten a limp Oreo, a little on the stale side, the cookies were a little limp. But she poured some Pepsi, she placed the cookies on a little plate, she asked me to say the blessing, and she invited us to eat and drink. And there in her humble abode, she was so proud to share that meal with us. Well, it came time for us to leave. We thanked her for the hospitality. We promised to remember her and her partners, her project, in our prayers, to share their story back home in our churches. And she thanked us for our prayers, thanked us for visiting, invited us to come again. And then she said the most remarkable, disturbing thing I think I've ever been told. She said, "I will also pray for you. I will pray for you and all the people of your churches, because I think it must be more dangerous to have too much than to have too little. It must be more dangerous to have too much than to have too little." You talk about a long conversation over a meal, a conversation I continue to have every time I open my closet, my cupboard, my checkbook. A long conversation. I shared with the first service that I was prompted a few years ago to write my senators when I heard that the Senate was considering establishing a congressional Wall Street oversight agency, and I thought Evangeline would make a superb member. Unfortunately, I have not heard back, but I don't lose hope. In my last year as director of Week of Compassion, I traveled to Darfur, Sudan, to visit the work of Action by Churches Together, one of our great partner networks, who were working at the time in what was surely one of the worst humanitarian disasters anywhere in the world. More than 250,000 people, mostly civilians, killed. More than 2.5 million people made homeless, many of them living in the most difficult and dangerous conditions imaginable in teeming refugee camps. And in the midst of all of this, our ACT partners were providing water and sanitation, health care and education, and other basic assistance for tens upon tens of thousands of Darfuris. One of our visits included an afternoon with a group of women in a camp of some 50,000 people. One of the programs that we were supporting with our ACT partners was one that was working in psychosocial care with traumatized women. And this was going to be an opportunity to meet with a group of those women who were benefiting from that particular project. This group of women, we were told, met together several times a week to support one another, maybe to make handicrafts, maybe to sing together, sometimes simply to be together, to talk, so they could begin to cope with what had happened to them and to their families. We gathered in a tent, one of those ubiquitous blue tents provided by the UN. We sat on Church World Service blankets that they had spread there on the ground. And we began to listen to their stories, stories of what life had been like in their villages and on their farms before the violence began. We heard stories of the unspeakable horrors visited upon them by the Janjaweed, the devils on horseback. We heard stories of what life was like in the camps, of the food shortages, of the torrential rains and the rainy season, of the dust and heat in the dry season, of the thousands upon thousands of young kids with nothing to do. They also talked about their hopes for peace and for the chance one day to return to their homes. And then they asked us about our stories. They wanted to know where we were from. They wanted to know what our communities and our families were like, about our places of worship. And then they invited us to their table. They served us some kind of orange drink. It reminded me a bit of Tang, if some of you all remember Tang. They had some kind of little sweet, almost greasy biscuits. One of us was asked to say the blessing. And we sat there and we shared this meal when one old woman who had not said a word during the story time, when she stood up and asked if she might say something. And she thanked us for coming. She thanked us for noticing them, for spending the afternoon with them, for listening to their stories and for sharing our stories. And then she said, "You have, if only for a little while this afternoon, you have made us feel like human beings again. You have made us feel like human beings again simply by noticing us, listening to us, sharing a little meal with us." I noticed, I think my colleagues noticed, a taste in our mouths strangely reminiscent of bread and wine. Long conversation on the way together as life happens around a table, and it was a great dinner. But I continue to learn that these companions are not just in Haiti or in Darfur or in the Congo or in Syria or Afghanistan. They're also very much in places like Cedar Bluff, Mississippi, and in places like Bloomington, Indiana. A few years ago, when our household, my wife and I, began drinking organic milk, Deb had read an article about the possible negative impact of food additives, especially growth hormones and antibiotics in milk, may have on children's behavior. And she figured if it was true for young children, it might explain what was the matter with me, so she thought we should start drinking organic milk. This past fall, Deb called me. I happened to be up in Tupelo where I was doing some work with our church there. You all know Tupelo, that's where Elvis was born. He even shows up from time to time. So it was a little late in the evening. She asked if I could run by the grocery and pick up a few items before I came home. And on her little list was a carton of milk. I don't do a lot of the shopping, and I did not really realize that organic milk is quite a bit more expensive than the standard kind. When I get up to the checkout counter, I made some off-the-cuff remark about the price. Just kind of off the cuff. And the checkout lady burst into tears. Well, I didn't know what in the world I had done or said to cause that. I'm trying to apologize. I'm embarrassed. I feel terrible about it. I certainly didn't mean to say anything hateful or hurtful directed to her. I didn't know what to do. She actually stepped away from the register. I thought she was going to get the manager. I'm standing there feeling like 2 pennies waiting for change. I didn't know what to do. She finally steps back to the register to complete the transaction, and I apologized again. She apologized to me. And she said, "Sir, it was not anything that you said." And I said, "Well, ma'am, I don't mean to be nosy, but obviously something is the matter. What's the matter?" And she said, "Well, it's just that I'm working 2 part-time jobs. My landlord has raised the rent. My kid is sick. I don't have insurance, and I don't know what I'm going to do." And I was fussing about the price of milk. A long conversation on the way together as life happens around a meal. I've learned something about this church. First, I read about it on the website, and then I experienced a bit of it last night and this morning. First Christian Church in Bloomington, Indiana is a steadfast and faithful witness in this community and beyond. To this life that we live in faith is a long conversation on the way together as life happens, and how often it is around the table. You are a witness of what it means to receive and also to share God's abundance, and especially to share that abundance with the poor and the hungry and the homeless, those who have been left out and cast out and cut out, people who long for a bit of dignity and care, who want to feel like what it means to be a human being again. And you don't need to remind me to remind you that it is a great dinner. It is a great, great dinner. Now, before I forget, who would like to say the blessing? Amen.